What's going on, guys? It's Ben from Pragmatic Software Engineering. I'm really excited today to tell you guys about how loops work. Loops are going to change the way we program. Up until now, we've been using a lot of repetitive code, and in the example of printing out what's in an integer array, we have to write a statement of print or system.out.println array 0, and then basically copy and paste, but change the index to 1 through 9. So now we have this really repetitive and I would say ugly code, and we can actually coalesce all of this into a loop in one statement. Again, loops are going to change the way we program, and loops and arrays are going to allow us to take things from the singular and allow us to scale our inputs to hundreds, thousands, and maybe millions. So, I hope I've done a great job of selling it. Let's get into it. Loops allow us to create some code that is rerunnable, which is really excellent because that means we don't have to write more code that does the same thing. You can see two different flavors of loops. The first one we will be talking about is called a while loop, and the second one is called a for loop. I got some feedback from my last video that it would be helpful to create some sort of slide where people can understand the terms that we're going to be using for both just as a glossary, but also something you can use to Google, just in case I don't do a good job of explaining. So a Boolean, we've talked about this, is some expression that evaluates to true or false. An iteration is one execution of a loop. A for loop is a loop that is used with some beginning state, some state to continue, and some post-iteration step. A while loop is a loop that continues to run given a certain Boolean evaluates to true. A loop continue is a way for us to skip the current execution of an iteration. So we can skip an iteration by using this continue. And we can also stop the loop using a break keyword. We're going to get into this more in detail, but I figured it might be helpful for just calling these terms out. So to give more of a definition to a while loop uses some Boolean condition to know if it should continue to run. One of the things that I see when people write while loops, or when I write while loops, is you'll create a while loop to do something, but you'll never create a way to stop executing that loop. So as a big joke in programmer culture or programmer humor is the concept of lather, rinse, and repeat. And there's a joke that goes, how did the programmer die in the shower? Well, he read the instructions, lather, rinse, repeat. The joke is here that the programmer will lather his hair, rinse his hair, repeat. He will lather, rinse, repeat, and infinitely repeat this loop. Let's talk about an example to use a while loop. And then in this example, I'm practicing guitar to play a song in front of some audience, right? So we know this. If you're not ready to play the song, then you have to continue practicing. So we're going to write this pseudo code. By the way, pseudo code is this basically informal description of how the code runs. What's kind of funny about pseudo code is it really has no definition. It could be whatever you like. You're just documenting how the code should work. In the Java syntax here, we have a while keyword, and we actually encapsulate a Boolean statement within parentheses. And while I'm not ready to play the song, then I will practice. Again, we see these curly braces here, and by now you're starting to see that these curly braces denote a context to run something in. So we use if statements with curly braces, we use functions with curly braces, we use classes with curly braces, and now we finally use loops with curly braces. And inside the curly brace, we write the instruction that is to be looped. Now, hopefully, whoever implements this practice function allows us to, at some time, to be ready to play the song, or else we will loop forever. So that's what a while loop is. A while loop allows us to repeat code on some sort of state, some sort of condition, some sort of Boolean. You tend to see while loops used with some sort of state change. You do not see them for iterating over collections like an array. As an example, you may have some code that is constantly running because the customer is looking at some sort of thing and you want that thing to update. Let me give you a better example. I'm looking at my phone and I'm watching the stock price of something change. In my phone, there's a while loop that says, while we are displaying this page, while Ben's looking at this page, I am going to constantly go get the most updated stock price from the whatever API it is and render it to him on his phone. Now, if you wanted to use a for loop to do this, this is very clumsy and this is not the best usage of a for loop. A for loop, as we will see in a couple seconds, is usually used for some sort of iteration over a collection or a sequence or something like that. Now, there are in different languages a level of abstraction on top of a for loop. In Java, we have something called a for each loop. It makes things a little bit easier. I don't think that we should talk about for each loops. I think that it's important for us to talk about for loops because they're in every single language. If you want to investigate a for each loop, I'll have some sort of link below that you can take a look at. But with that, let's get started and take a look at these for loops. Now let's talk about a for loop. But before we start writing for loops, I think it's healthy for us to evolve our while loop use case into a for loop. So when you have a for loop, to give you a really good explanation of what a for loop is designed with a beginning state, some statement that evaluates to a Boolean of whether or not to continue to execute, and what to do at the end of a loop iteration. When you provide the current state, the beginning state, you typically use an integer, but this is not always the case. Let's take this example and let's mature and evolve a while loop into a for loop. Let me put out my pointer here just to make this easier. So some assumptions. Our backpack is an object array, and therefore because it is an array, we access it via an index. So our pseudocode will look like this. We create a new backpack, we set our index to be 0, while our index is less than the backpack's length. We check to see if something is trash. If it is, we will throw it out, and we will increment our index by 1 to make sure that we finally break the loop at some point in time. So let's break this down, but let's talk about this in Java terms. Again, here are our assumptions in the top left corner, and our Java code now says that our backpack is of type school supply array, and the index is an integer. So we're going to execute this loop while the index is less than the backpack.length because we want to make sure that we do not get a illegal index exception. What we're going to do is we're going to get backpack subindex and ask if it is trash, and we're going to throw out that backpack subindex. Finally, we will increase our index by 1. This allows us to go through the backpack, and when we are finished with the backpack, this Boolean statement will then evaluate to false, and we will no longer run this while loop. If we break this down, the backpack is an array, as you can see here. And during the loop, we can figure out what the current school supply is and if it is trash. The way we do that is using this this index here when we're accessing the backpack array. But this really means that backpack subindex is the current school supply. So when you see this code and you see this sort of like this sort of string here, this text here that says backpack of index, that really means the current school supply that we're looking at. Finally, we have to make sure that this while loop does end, and so we actually add 1 to index at the end of this while loop's iteration. Now, what I just showed you with the while loop is not common. It's considered very ugly and an incorrect use of the while loop. Although it does functionally work, it is not sort of common practice to use while loops like that. We use these for loops that you see here. Let me put my pointer on again. we see this for loop here, and this is how we go through an array. So we can boil down our code into creating the array and then using a for loop to iterate through the array. Now we talked about how do we know, or what questions do we need to ask before we write the array? We need to know the beginning state, which is we create an index and it starts at 0. We know to continue to run when the index is less than the backpack's length. And what do we do after an iteration? We add 1 to the index. So these are color-coded here, but basically I've color-coded the syntax to its sort of step or information we know. So you see here we're creating an index and starting it at 0. We have a Boolean expression to know if we should continue to run. And we have this step here of adding 1 to the index finally at the end of this piece of code. Do notice here that these are separated by semicolons. Now, again, here's that sort of curly brace sort of scope here that we use with loops. And here's an if statement, and we are now throwing out the backpack subindex. And you see we are not incrementing index in the loop anymore. It's handled by the for loop. Now that we've talked about for loops, it's important to talk about how to control a for loop. Now we have this idea of, in a for loop, to iterate in a range of numbers, or a while loop to repeat the code given a state. Sometimes it may make sense for us to skip the current element in a for loop or skip the current iteration in a while loop. Or it may make sense for us to break the loop, to stop executing the loop and exit the loop immediately. These are called continues and breaks. It may also make sense for us to stop processing the array given some condition. You can stop any while loop you want by using the break keyword. Now you may say, Ben, what if I just turn this statement, the Boolean expression that tells us to continue to run, to something that evaluates to false? Well, you can do that, but if you do that, that check to see if the Boolean evaluates to true happens at the end of an iteration. If you need to stop something dead in the water mid-iteration, use the break keyword. Now, there's a concept of skipping an iteration of a loop. So perhaps something in the array is null. If we go back to our example here, what happens if backpack subindex evaluates to null? And we call null.isTrash. Well, we get a null pointer exception. There can be a way for us to skip this, and we do this with the continue keyword. So let's do a little exercise here. Let's pretend we don't know anything about loops. And let's create an array of integer, specifically a boxed integer, because we're going to put nulls in this, and you'll see why in a second. Let me name this array. Equals, oh, this should be actually, my syntax is messed up here. Excuse me. New integer. Actually, it just needs to equal 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we have this array. And so we can do system out print array sub 0. So let's do this. And then because this is a box type supports a toString function on the box type. So let's do this, toString. So let's say we just want to print out every single number in this array. Starting to see that it's kind of ugly, isn't it? Oh, man. I'm so sorry, Gary Paulus. You're going to hate me. Gary Paulus was a teacher of mine who taught me in a program. I'm sure if he's watching this video, he's going to be very frustrated with me. But let's run this. And let me also add the last one. So this is a way that we can print out this array, but this is like so, I don't even know, like naive and unnuanced, it's not even funny. What we can do instead is we can use a for loop to do this exactly, to recreate this exact feature or functionality. So the way we do this is for int I equals 0, I is greater than array dot length I++. Again, beginning statement. How do I know to continue to run? What do I do after an iteration of the array? Or iteration of the loop, sorry. And what I can do is system.out.print array. I'm going to put some spaces in here so you can see. And I can plug in this I here into this array. And I can call this toString. Let's run it. Kaboom, it's the same thing. So now that we know that this works the same way, let me get rid of it because it's useless. Now, what happens if I put null in here? This is going to fail. Let's see. Oh, there's that dreaded null pointer exception. So what can we use here that we've talked about to stop a bad iteration from running? Well, what we can do is we can use the continue keyword. So what we'll do is we'll check, hey, is array I equal, or is array I, is it null? If so, let's continue. Now you see we've printed out we have no exception and we've skipped the null. Now for some reason, let's say you want to only go up to the number 9. Let's say, let's change some of these values around. We'll do 200, 300, 400, 500. Let's say for some reason you don't want to execute anything past 700. So what you can do here is you say if the array sub I is equal to, greater than or equal to 700, we will break. This means that we'll stop executing immediately if we see 700. So we should see only 0, 200, 300, 400, 500. We're going to skip the null, and because we encounter 700 here, we will break immediately. We won't print out 700, 800, 900, or 1000. Let's run it. Kaboom. See, we don't see that null. We don't see that 700. Hopefully, now you understand when to use a while loop and when to use a for loop. And you know how to use breaks and continues to skip unneeded executions of those loops and actually break those loops. For those of you who are a little bit more advanced and you understand how to use lists and hash maps, be very careful when you're using for loops and while loops. Do not try to add or remove things to the collection you are working with. This will cause a concurrency issue. You may need to use a different type of map or list to do this. As a general rule of thumb, you should never edit the collection you are editing with if it's not an array. If you do need to do this, you should create another map or another list. If you don't know what a map or a list is, stay tuned. We'll be having some sessions or some videos on what those are and how to use them in the best way possible. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed this. If this was helpful, or if you just like my new background or taking a tour of my home, like the video, subscribe, maybe show it to your friends. If you don't like this video, you think I could have explained something a little bit better, or you're still confused, feel free to send me a message or leave a comment, and I'll do my best to respond to you. Thanks, guys.